You mentioned first time we spoke that about half of the companies you invest in are in enterprise, let's say enterprise software, enterprise AI now. 30%, I think you said, were like deep tech. So you've done everything from like, rare minerals being generated in a lab, nuclear energy investments, and then about 20% on the consumer side. How do you identify which company is the right company for you in Hoxton to invest in?
Yeah, so we have a simple thesis, and we don't always get it right, but we try and stick to this thesis, is we think these big asymmetric outcomes, like the big new markets of tomorrow, are generated when something has changed in the market, and the something change could be cultural, like that could be a driver, is often technological, like there's something that you can do with the stack that's today that you just couldn't have done before. Um, yeah, sometimes it's regulatory, like the markets have opened up because the regulators have opened up. A lot of the fintech stuff was probably along that theme. And when those markets open up like that, there's usually sometimes they get captured by incumbents if they're too close to home, and sometimes they get captured by greenfield. Like sometimes they are greenfield, so they get captured by new companies because no one really knows. It's kind of the blind man and the elephant, right? The shape of the new market. You don't really know what the new market looks like. Like this morning, I had breakfast with a friend of mine who's an early angel slash like seed investor in Kalshi, which is like Kalshi and Polymarket are the predictive betting companies. And this predictive betting stuff has been there for like 20, 30 years and has always been kind of niche. And then something changed culturally a few years ago where these two, and particularly like the Trump election, these things became really big predictors of like the election kind of then became, and then gambling laws came down in the US. It just became much more like they're not quite gambling, but they're like in that same kind of vein. And so these new markets then kind of open up and it's not captured by the incumbent because there is no incumbent in greenfield. And that's what we're looking for is like what's changed in the ecosystem technologically or culturally or regulatory that allows the company to get born. And then if the company gets born, is this one that's born on the European side of the pond going to become the big global winner? And historically, that's not necessarily the case, but it is like increasingly turning out to be the case. It's not every single time, but it is like no longer like 0.1%. It's probably like 10, 15% of some of these companies or some of these themes end up getting captured by the European company. And then that becomes a dominant company. And I would say that has to then become a global company, not just a European company. And so this bridge back to California really matters. I think the bridge back to California also really matters because I think if you're looking at these companies and you don't know what's going on that side of the pond, it's really hard for you to discern, is it really best in class or is it going to be the also ran? It's like we did a robotics foundation model and there's a bunch of money going into robotics right now and at the AI level. And if you don't have the compare and contrast ability of what's going on in the Bay Area, then it's really hard to know if this group that's kind of coming out from Europe is actually really well equipped. Otherwise, you're building like the European and by the way, there's a whole trend of people trying to build like the European versions of things. I'm a little bit more skeptical whether those things really create like super long-term value. I can understand them in like things like defense, but like generally it's a winner take all market. We did this long time ago. We did this like chart of like in social networking. If you chart it out by enterprise value market cap of that entire industry, and there were a whole bunch of companies, like people forget this, like Bebo was sold for 850 million
R.I.P.
bucks.
Bebo. I used to love that site.
It was like the dominant one in Ireland, and it kind of came across the pond here. That's what got Michael Birch, who founded Pro Founders, the money to be able to do that. He also built the Battery in San Francisco because he went to San Francisco and he was like, there's no Soho House in San Francisco, so I'm going to go use my money, which is this Bebo money, which he'd sold to AOL for $850 to go build the Soho House replica, which has now become like a huge thing in the Bay Area, right? It's the Battery. Everyone knows what the Battery is. So like, these things are positives for the entire ecosystem in many ways when people get wealthy this way. But there was 20 in Spain, there was like Bebo here, there was Myspace. Like, but if you chart it out, it's like a big giant square, and then you shade in the areas for like how much market cap each particular company kind of captured. The entire square visually looks like Meta. Like everything else is kind of sort of around the curve. And so like that's what you're looking for, right? You're looking for this new category and the winner of the category, and the winner of the category takes so much of the overall value created by the category. And, if you did that same thing for music streaming and you did the same kind of shading exercise, Spotify would take a huge percentage of that market share, right? Of that kind of value kind of created. Then the number two would kind of be like Apple Music and the number three would be Amazon. And they're they're very distant number two, number threes compared to Spotify, and there's no other company that's kind of come in, to be able to compete. Deezer in France, but like it's not the same. It's not in the same league as a Spotify. Pandora for radio in the U.S., but like it's a footnote in history again. Like you don't think about it anymore. So like these things happen, and they can be European outcomes, and we're trying to find those, and we don't think they happen in the same industry time and time again, because we are kind of we're the continent that produces the exception to the rule. Like you could maybe kind of sort of argue Spotify, and I don't think to be even remotely accurate, but like a lot of popular music is produced by Swedish producer. There's like one Swedish producer at the helm of many of the hit songs. So you could like kind of maybe say the reason why Spotify worked in Sweden is because like they have this tradition of producing world-class pop music. But like, that's not the reason. It just so happened to be that Spotify figured out the user interface, figured out how to deal with the labels, started in Europe, kept going in this industry when no one else really wanted to touch this industry, struggled to raise the first few rounds of capital because it wasn't an obvious thing to do because you didn't know if you were going to get the contracts, and then turned out to be the big winner. And yeah, obviously the founder is great. I was able to kind of guide the company all the way through that kind of very, topsy-turvy journey, right? Because these things are never linear. But they do appear in Europe, and like that's what we shop for. I think where we get it wrong sometimes is like something looks really good, is a good idea, it's a really good team, it's a really good founder, and then we kind of make a little, like we kind of relax some of these constraints a little bit. Like, is it really a new category? Is it really a new market? Is it really going to become a big market? Is it really going to become the winner in the market? And that's where we've probably been burned historically. But I think we try and hold to this like pretty well. And we also make the inverse problem. Sometimes we see all those characteristics and we talk ourselves out of the deal, which is like even more painful and punishing in many ways, because like then you miss a bunch of the value capture. Like we spent weeks talking to Tom at Monzo when it was Mondo. Well, we started talking to Tom when it was still at Starling before he got fired by Ann or left and took the whole team. It's obvious in hindsight that there's like a regulatory opening to build that company, and we were not convinced about the regulatory opening, and we were also not so convinced whether it would be a UK bank or a global bank, and we got trapped by our own thinking around must be global, right? And didn't end up writing the check. Should have written the first million. Would have made a lot more money. We missed Revolut entirely. So like, that one is less of it's a bigger lamentation. Like, why did we miss it? But like, it's much like it's the ones that you've spent real time with and then you've said no to, like, that they're really kind of hurt. But generally that's our framework for thinking about things.